The Geredity brothers built about as good a fire as two experienced trappers could build, and everyone who saw the remains of that camp the next morning said so. A tight ring of stone, a deep bed of coals still holding heat well past dawn, enough split wood stacked beside it to have carried that blaze clean through the night without ever needing tending. By every outward measure, Silas and Thomas Geredity had done exactly what two capable men were supposed to do before bedding down in open country in the last hard cold of that spring. A neighbor found them both still lying near that fire the next afternoon, when they didn't come in for supplies as expected. Neither man had a mark on him, no claw, no bite, nothing torn or dragged. A bear had been seen twice that same week working the tree line not far from where they'd made camp. And for a long while afterward, that's the story that got told and retold up and down that stretch of country. The bear got blamed the way a bear always gets blamed, because it's easier to picture teeth in the dark than to picture the truth, which was considerably quieter and considerably closer to home. Here's the thing that ought to stop you cold, friend, the same way it stopped every man who heard how those two were actually found. That bear never came within 100 yards of the Geredity camp. The fire the brothers built was, by any honest measure, a good one. Hot, well-fed, correctly built. Neither man froze from lack of heat in the air around him. What killed Silas and Thomas Geredity that night was lying directly against the bare, half-frozen ground, with nothing beneath them but their own coats, 12 inches from a fire that was doing exactly what a fire is supposed to do, and never once realizing that the fire was only ever fighting half the battle. That's the myth I need you to unlearn today, and I promise you it isn't campfire talk dressed up to scare you. It's written into pioneer diaries, into early wilderness medicine texts, and into modern search and rescue reports from hikers and hunters who die this same exact way in country with paved roads 20 minutes off. The myth said a big enough fire keeps a man warm through the night, full stop no matter what he's lying on. That myth has killed more settlers, trappers, and travelers caught out in open country than every bear that ever walked the frontier, and it is still killing experienced outdoorsmen today. Camping in country far tamer than anything the Geredity brothers ever crossed. Here's the twist, and I'm going to build you all the way to it today. The same slow way it was handed down to me. A fire warms the air around you and the side of your body facing it. It does nothing at all for the side of your body touching the ground, and the ground, especially cold, damp, or half-frozen ground, pulls heat directly out of a resting body far faster than open air ever could. Fire or no fire nearby. There is one habit that experienced frontier travelers never skipped. One piece of camp making that mattered more than the size of the fire itself. And it's the exact piece the Geredity brothers, tired after a long day's trapping, chose to skip that one night. We'll get all the way there. Stay with me by choice, neighbor. This one's worth every minute of it. I'm Elias Thorne, 7th generation on the Hollis Thorne homestead out in the Old Dakota Territory. My grandmother Ruth's own father ran trap lines through some of the same rough country the Geredity brothers worked, and he was among the men who helped carry those two home. He never forgot what he saw, and he made certain the lesson got handed down whole. Every single time our family made camp anywhere off our own land for the rest of his life, he built one particular thing before he ever struck a match for the fire, and I'm going to show you exactly what that was and why the order mattered as much as the thing itself. The skill you're about to learn didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because most people today associate a cold night outdoors with a sleeping bag rated for the temperature and call the problem solved, never realizing that the single biggest factor in a cold night's survival was worked out by frontier travelers 2 centuries before insulated sleeping bags ever existed, using nothing but pine boughs, dry leaves, and bark. Outdoor gear companies want you buying a warmer bag rated to a lower number on the tag, and there's nothing dishonest in that. But a warm bag on cold, bare ground still loses you heat all night long from underneath, and there's no product on a shelf that fixes that one detail for you. That's the piece that quietly got lost. By the time we're done today, you'll know how to read a campsite the way an experienced frontier traveler read one. How a fire was actually meant to be built and positioned. The one addition to a camp that mattered more than the fire's size. The exact mistake that felt like nothing more than being tired after a long day. And why a body can keep losing heat all night long lying 12 inches from a roaring fire without a single outward sign that anything at all is wrong. Before we get into the camp itself, Pull the trigger on subscribe. Not for me, friend, because the buried skills we drag back into daylight around here, you're going to want the next one. There are 6 pieces to this, 6 in order, and every frontier traveler who slept safely through a hard night in open country kept everyone without exception. Miss the first 2, you've picked a bad ground to begin with. Miss the third, the fire's doing all the work alone. Miss the fourth, you make the exact mistake that cost the Geredity brothers everything. Miss the fifth, you never understand why it's dangerous until it's already happening to you. Miss the sixth, and there's no fire big enough to save you. Piece 1. Before a single stick gets gathered for a fire, a frontier traveler had to choose the ground itself. And this decision mattered more than almost anything that came after it. Picture a stretch of open timber late in the day, light going gray, a tired traveler looking for a spot to make camp. The instinct, especially for a man worn out from a long day, is to stop at the first flat, clear patch that presents itself. Experienced frontier travelers knew to resist that instinct and look for a few specific things instead. Avoid low hollows and the bottoms of draws, even though they often look sheltered and inviting. Cold air is heavier than warm air and sinks, pooling in low ground overnight, which means the bottom of a gully or a creek bed can run noticeably colder than a spot just 20 or 30 feet higher up a gentle slope. A mid-slope position, neither at the very bottom nor exposed at the very top, avoids both the cold air pooling below and the wind exposure above. Check for dampness in the ground itself before committing to a spot. Damp or waterlogged ground conducts heat away from a resting body considerably faster than dry ground does. For the same basic reason, wet clothing chills you faster than dry clothing does. A spot that looks perfectly flat and clear can still be sitting on ground holding moisture just beneath the surface, particularly near creek bottoms, meadows, or anywhere snowmelt has recently passed through. Look for natural windbreak, a fallen log, a stand of dense brush, a rock outcropping positioned so it blocks the prevailing wind rather than simply looking sheltered from where you happen to be standing. Wind pulls heat away from both a body and a fire considerably faster than still air does, and a fire built in the lee of a good windbreak burns more efficiently and throws its heat more usefully than one left exposed. Early frontier travel journals described this site selection process in careful, repeated detail, because getting it wrong meant a genuinely miserable, dangerous night, regardless of how good everything else about the camp turned out to be. Modern wilderness survival guidance from search and rescue organizations describes the exact same 3 priorities today, in almost identical language. Mid-slope positioning, dry ground, wind protection, because the physics behind all 3 hasn't changed one particle since the frontier. The mistake most beginners make is choosing a campsite purely on how clear and flat it looks, without ever checking the ground itself for dampness or considering where cold air will settle once night falls. A gorgeous, flat, open meadow is very often the coldest and dampest option available in a stretch of country that has better choices sitting just a short walk away. Time of year and the specific ground cover mattered too. A meadow that looks perfectly dry and inviting in late afternoon sun can still be sitting on frost-heaved or partially thawed ground just beneath a thin crust, especially in early spring or late fall when day and night temperatures swing hard. Pressing a boot heel firmly into a prospective campsite and checking what comes up, dry duff and needles, or a dark, damp give underneath, told an experienced traveler more in 5 seconds than staring at the surface ever would. This week, if you ever make camp outdoors, walk the immediate area and check these 3 things honestly before settling. Mid-slope, not low ground. Dry underfoot, tested with a boot heel, not just judged by eye. Windbreak behind you, not open exposure. That's your foundation before a single stick of firewood gets touched. Piece 2. Once the ground is chosen, the fire itself has a correct shape and position. And this is where most people actually do get it right, which is exactly why the next piece so often gets skipped entirely. Build your fire far enough from where you'll actually lie down to avoid scorching or smoke, but close enough that its radiant heat reaches you meaningfully. Roughly the length of a grown man lying down is the traditional working distance many frontier accounts describe. Too close risks burns and sparks landing on bedding. Too far, and the fire's heat barely reaches you at all through open, moving night air. A reflector, a simple wall of green logs, stacked stone, or a woven brush barrier set up on the far side of the fire from where you'll sleep. bounces a meaningful amount of radiant heat back toward you instead of losing it uselessly into the open dark beyond the flames. Frontier travelers without a natural rock face or fallen log to use for this purpose built one deliberately, stacking green, unseasoned logs which resist catching fire themselves while still reflecting real heat. Feed the fire to burn long and steady rather than hot and fast. A large bed of coals, built up over the early evening and then banked to smolder slowly, throws consistent heat through the full night far better than a tall, roaring blaze that burns through its fuel in an hour and leaves nothing but cold ash by midnight. This is a skill in its own right, choosing the right mix of fast-burning kindling wood and slower, dense hardwood to build a fire that lasts. Government wilderness guides and modern search and rescue training materials both still describe this same reflector and coal bed approach as one of the most efficient ways to get real, sustained warmth from a single fire through a long night, confirming what frontier travelers worked out through hard experience 2 centuries earlier, with nothing but trial, error, and cold nights to teach them. The mistake here, when there is one, is usually building a fire that's impressive to look at, tall and bright, but burns through its fuel too fast to still be providing real heat by 3 in the morning, the coldest part of any night. A fire that looks the most dramatic at 9 in the evening is not always the fire doing the most good work at 4. This week, if you ever build an overnight fire, practice building one with a reflector wall and a deep banked coal bed rather than simply piling wood high and letting it blaze. The goal isn't the biggest fire. It's the fire still quietly working for you hours after you've stopped tending it. Piece 3. Here is the piece almost every modern person skips entirely, the one that mattered more to a frontier traveler's survival than the fire itself, and the one the Geredity brothers left out that night. Before ever lying down, before even finishing the fire in some traveler accounts, build your bed off the bare ground. A thick layer, at minimum several inches deep, of dry material, pine or spruce boughs laid overlapping like shingles, dry leaves and grass packed densely, bark laid flat. Anything dry and thick enough to put real distance and real insulation between a resting body and the ground itself. This isn't padding for comfort, though it does happen to be more comfortable. Its actual purpose is stopping the single fastest form of heat loss a resting body faces overnight, which we'll walk through fully in a moment. Frontier travelers, trappers, and later organized wagon parties crossing open country all describe this bough bed or ground bed as standard, non-negotiable practice, built new at every single camp regardless of how tired the day had left them. The correct method matters here too. Boughs laid with their cut ends down and their leafy tips up and overlapping, shingled the way roofing shingles overlap, both traps a meaningful layer of still air within the material and sheds any ground moisture that might otherwise wick upward into a traveler's bedding. A thin, haphazard scattering of loose boughs does very little. A properly layered bed, several inches thick, does a great deal. Where dry boughs weren't available, dense dry grass, leaves, or even a thick layer of gathered bark served the same purpose. The specific material mattered far less than the principle behind it, which was always the same. Put meaningful insulating material, and meaningful thickness of it, between yourself and the bare ground, before you ever consider the night's sleeping arrangement settled. Later organized wagon parties crossing the plains carried this same principle forward even as their equipment changed, with driver's guides and emigrant handbooks printed for the trail advising travelers to lay wagon canvas, buffalo robes, or cut brush beneath their bedding whenever the ground was bare or damp, rather than trusting blankets and a fire alone. The material available shifted from region to region and decade to decade. The underlying rule never did. The mistake almost everyone makes trying to picture this scene is imagining the fire as the main event and the ground bed as an afterthought. Nice if you have the energy left for it after a long day. Experienced frontier travelers had this exactly backward. Ruth's father used to say the fire warms the front of a tired man. The bed beneath him is the only thing keeping the back of him from losing everything the fire just gave him. This week, if you ever sleep outdoors, whether camping for pleasure or caught out by circumstance, build a ground layer at least a few inches thick beneath wherever you'll lie, using whatever dry material is actually available. Before you consider your camp finished, regardless of how good your sleeping bag or blanket happens to be. Pattern break, friend. Everything up to here, an experienced frontier traveler did correctly, without fail, every single time. What comes next is where two capable, experienced trappers, tired after a hard day, made the one decision that felt like no decision at all. Piece 4. The mistake that felt like simply being too tired to bother. Picture two exhausted men at the end of a long day's trapping, cold, already settling in, muscles worn out. A good fire already crackling and throwing real, welcome heat into the clearing. Building a proper bough bed takes real, sustained effort after a day like that. Gathering armfuls of boughs, laying them correctly, building up a thickness that actually does the job. It is, without question, the most physically demanding single task in making camp, and it's the one most easily justified away in the moment as unnecessary. Since the fire is right there, already working, already throwing heat, a tired man can feel directly on his skin. Silas and Thomas Geredity had every reason, in the moment, to believe that fire alone would carry them through. They could feel its heat directly. It was doing something real and noticeable and immediate. Skipping the bough bed didn't feel like skipping a critical safety step. It felt like skipping an optional comfort, extra padding for a good night's sleep on ground two tired men were perfectly willing to simply lie down on directly. Coats bunched beneath them, fire close at hand. Here's the trap, and it's the same trap that's caught careful, competent, experienced outdoorsmen for 2 centuries. A fire's warmth is real, immediate, and easy to judge correctly in the moment. Ground heat loss is slow, gradual, and gives almost no immediate feeling a tired person naturally associates with danger. The fire feels like it's winning the battle for warmth because you can feel it winning. The ground, meanwhile, is quietly winning a completely separate battle you can't feel happening at all until it's already cost you a great deal. Early frontier accounts and modern search and rescue case reports both describe this exact same pattern with remarkable consistency. It is very rarely careless, inexperienced people who die this way. It is very often capable, experienced outdoorsmen, exhausted at the end of a long day, who make the same reasonable-feeling judgment that a good fire is doing the whole job, on a night when the ground beneath them was quietly doing the opposite. This week, make the rule now, before you're standing tired beside a good fire at the end of a long day. The ground bed gets built before you consider the night's camp finished, regardless of how good the fire already feels, regardless of how tired you are. That single rule is the hinge this entire story turns on. Now we get to the piece almost nobody explains clearly, the reason two experienced men lying 12 inches from a good fire never felt the danger closing in on them at all. That's next. Piece 5. Why the cold coming up from underneath gave no honest warning until it was already doing serious harm. The human body loses heat to its surroundings through several different paths, and they are not remotely equal in how fast they work. Heat lost to moving air. The kind a person feels as wind chill is real and can be significant, but it happens gradually, and it's a form of heat loss the body and mind both recognize easily, since we're all familiar with the feeling of a cold wind and instinctively act to block it. Heat lost through direct contact with a colder solid surface works on a completely different principle, and it works considerably faster. Solid ground, especially damp or half-frozen ground, conducts heat away from anything warmer that touches it directly at a rate that dramatically outpaces simple air exposure. For the same basic reason, a metal railing feels shockingly colder to bare skin on a winter day than the air around it does, even though both are sitting at the exact same temperature. Contact with a good conductor pulls heat away fast and continuously, in a way moving air simply cannot match. A person lying directly on bare, cold ground is in continuous, unbroken contact with that conductive heat loss for every single minute they remain still, across the entire surface of their body touching the earth all night long. A fire nearby can genuinely be warming their face and the front of their body through radiant heat at the very same time the ground beneath them is steadily, continuously pulling core body heat away through direct contact. And because these two processes feel completely different to the senses, warmth on the face reads as reassuring proof that everything is fine, while the steady loss happening against the back and the legs produces no comparable, obvious sensation at all until real damage has already been done. This is how a person can grow dangerously, even fatally cold, while lying beside a fire that is, by every honest measure, burning perfectly well. And here is the part that makes this especially dangerous, rather than simply uncomfortable. As core body temperature drops, one of the earliest and most insidious effects is on judgment and awareness itself. Confusion, a kind of dulled indifference to the cold, even a paradoxical feeling of warmth in the more advanced stages, are all well-documented symptoms of developing hypothermia. A person growing dangerously cold this way is often the very last person in a position to recognize it happening and act to fix it, which is precisely why this particular danger has claimed capable, experienced people rather than only the careless or unprepared. I'm not a physician, friend, and I want to be straight with you the way I'd want someone straight with me. If you or anyone with you ever shows confusion, slurred speech, unusual clumsiness, or a strange indifference to obvious cold while camping or caught out in cold conditions, treat it as a serious medical emergency immediately. Get the person off the cold ground and insulated, and seek help without delay. Don't wait for shivering to stop, since in more advanced hypothermia, shivering can actually cease as the body's systems begin to shut down, which is a dangerous sign in itself, not a sign of recovery. This week, if you spend any real time outdoors in cold conditions, learn the basic signs of hypothermia's progression: confusion, clumsiness, slurred speech, that strange paradoxical warmth, well enough to recognize them in someone else, since the person actually experiencing it may be the least able to notice it themselves. We've covered choosing the ground, building the fire correctly, the ground bed that mattered more than the fire, the mistake that felt like nothing more than being tired, and exactly why the danger gives no honest warning. There's one piece left: the exact habit Ruth's father never skipped after that night. The one piece that stood between a hard, cold night survived, and what happened to the Geredity brothers. That's next. Piece 6. The habit that stood between a rough night and a funeral. Every experienced frontier traveler who slept safely through hard, cold nights in open country year after year kept one unbending order of operations, whether they could explain the physics of it or not. Ground first, fire second, sleep third, every single time, with no exceptions carved out for exhaustion, foul weather, or a fire that already felt like enough on its own. The ground bed got built while there was still light and energy enough to do it properly, before exhaustion could talk a tired man into skipping it. Ruth's father carried this rule the rest of his life after helping carry the Geredity brothers home, and he taught it to Ruth exactly the way it had been taught to him. Build your bed before you trust your fire. He said a good fire will make a cold night feel handled long before the ground beneath you has actually been dealt with, and that gap between feeling handled and actually being handled is exactly where two capable men lost everything on a night that should have simply been uncomfortable, not fatal. Here's why this piece still matters to you today, whether you're backcountry camping for pleasure or caught out somewhere by genuine circumstance. Modern outdoor gear companies want you buying a sleeping bag rated for a lower temperature, and a good bag genuinely does help. But a sleeping bag's rating assumes reasonable ground insulation is already in place beneath it. And search and rescue organizations still report cold exposure cases every single season involving experienced, well-equipped people who underestimated exactly how much heat bare or thinly insulated ground pulls out of a resting body overnight. The gear industry isn't lying to you by selling warmer bags. There's just no product on a shelf that replaces a few inches of dry insulating material between you and the earth. And there's no marketing budget behind reminding you of a free habit that costs nothing but effort at the end of a tired day. So here's your skill, whole and yours. Choose your ground first. Mid-slope, dry underfoot, windbreak at your back. Build your fire with a reflector and a deep banked coal bed, built to burn long and steady rather than tall and fast. Build a ground bed at least several inches thick, boughs shingled or dry material packed dense before you consider camp finished, no matter how tired you are or how good the fire already feels. Know that a fire warming your face is not proof the rest of you is safe, since ground contact pulls heat away far faster than open air ever could. Recognize the early signs of hypothermia in yourself and in others: confusion, clumsiness, slurred speech, a strange indifference to the cold. Since the person it's happening to is often the last to notice, And keep the order Ruth's father never broke. Ground before fire, fire before sleep, every single time, no exceptions for exhaustion. This was never really about camping, friend. It was about understanding that real, honest warmth in one part of your situation can exist at the exact same time. Real, invisible danger is building in another, and that the only thing standing between a rough night and a tragedy is knowing to check both. That's not survivalist theater, and it's not doom talk. That's ordinary competence, carried in the hands of every traveler who made it through a hard night in open country. And it costs you nothing but a little extra effort at the end of a tired day to carry it into your own camp tonight. You don't have to master every piece of this before your next trip outdoors. Do one thing. The next time you sleep outside for any reason, build a real ground layer, several inches of dry material, beneath yourself before you settle in, regardless of how good your gear already is. That's the whole entry ticket. That's the habit Ruth's father carried the rest of his life. Somebody just didn't get the chance to hand this one down to the Geredity brothers before that spring night came. That's what I was here for tonight. Tell me down below, has anyone in your family ever spent real time on a trap line, a cattle drive, or simply caught out overnight in open country? Different regions carry different versions of this exact lesson. And the story that pulls the most comments is the one I go deep on next. Your great-grandparents survived nights that would test anyone, and they did it with knowledge this ordinary, this unglamorous, and this easy to let slip. Don't let it die on your watch. Next time, the cotton myth that killed more frontier men than frostbite itself, and why the old wool coat your great-grandfather swore by worked for a reason store-bought jackets still get wrong. Keep the old ways they kept.